Who can help you undo the damage done by fire or water? Search no further than the experts at ServiceMaster Restore, who have the experience and know-how to make your home feel whole again. For 65 years, we've helped people go from disaster to done. ServiceMaster Restore. Who can help you undo the damage done by fire or water? Search no further than the experts at ServiceMaster Restore, who have the experience and know-how to make your home feel whole again. For 65 years, we've helped people go from disaster to done. ServiceMaster Restore.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on an insightful update on mold, moisture, and envelope failures. My name is David Muse, and I'm with Pinchin, and I'm the National Practice Lead for Indoor Environmental Quality for the company. And I'm here today with Gord Wojcicki. And Gord, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gord Wojcicki. I'm the National Practice Leader for Building Science and Sustainability at Pinchin. And I look forward to sharing some knowledge with you this morning, along with my colleague, Dave.
So we just before we start off, we'd just like to let everybody know that please, if you have any questions as we're going through the presentation, please don't hesitate to go in the chat and ask the questions. Gord and I will respond, and we can go from there. So an insightful update on mold, moisture, and envelope failures. It's refreshing to know that mold, after all these years, is still something that people are still want to know a bit about, and it's one of those fields that it's not rapidly changing like some of the things that have been going on in our lives lately, but the concepts are a lot of the same that you'll hear, but there'll be some new stuff too in this presentation. I wanted to relate a little bit to whether or not COVID has any bearing on our mold worlds. So we're going to talk on these topics for the next hour. We're going to talk a bit about mold growth in buildings, water damage restoration, and mold remediation. Gord is going to talk about building science and identifying and correcting indoor and outdoor moisture problems. And then I'm going to try to answer this question. Should there be any particular concerns with mold during COVID times? So we'll start with a little background on mold. Mold it's a rapidly growing microorganism of the fungi kingdom. Mold needs three things to grow. It needs an organic substrate, it needs sufficient moisture, and it needs temperature. Some may say there's a fourth thing it needs, and that's time. And I guess that makes sense to a degree. So if we look at those four things, an organic substrate, there's all kinds of things that mold likes to grow on, and we'll talk about some of those. It needs sufficient moisture to grow, it needs the proper temperature to grow, and it needs time. Well, we can't do anything about time. Time is going to pass. Temperature, we can control temperature to a certain degree, but there's a lot of temperature pieces that we can't control. And the organic substrate, there's always going to be something for mold to grow. The thing that we can and do have the most control over is moisture. So if you look at the photograph below, you can see there's we can see the mold growth. You see the hyphae, or the roots of the mold, we can see, and then the spores are what you see on the top. I compare this to like a dandelion that goes to seed. So if you get the big white puffy dandelion, we used to, as kids, used to blow them and try to blow them in our friends' faces and stuff like that. But those are the seeds. Every one of those dandelion things that take off. That's why we get our lawns full of beautiful yellow dandelions. But the mold spores work in the same way. One thing that's extremely important when we talk about mold is how rapid it can grow. The spores, mold spores, can germinate within 12 hours. They can start to grow within 12 hours of wetting, and that's really important because it means that we have to, if we're reacting to a flood or some kind of water incident, we have to react rapidly if we want to dry, because typically within 3 to 10 days we will we'll see spores growing. Now, most of the standards that we talk about, and we'll talk a little bit about the standards later on, they give us 24 to 48 hours to dry out. Otherwise, we must suspect mold growth on susceptible surfaces. Now, that's not to say that every time we get a water incident, we're going to have mold growing within 24 to 48 hours. That's not true at all. However, if we do wait that long before we start a drying process, we would be smart to at least do some inspection to make sure that there hasn't been some mold that's been growing. So what are some of the causes of mold growth in buildings? Number one, poor construction practices. This is one, if this frustrates me because we see it all the time and it's so preventable. We had a couple of incidents lately where one was a healthcare facility on the east coast of Canada, and the problem that the mistake they made is in the order they were building the building in. Like in this particular incident, they had drywall up before they had the building tight. So the roof wasn't tight, the windows weren't tight, and they were putting drywall in the building. We had a major rain, and they paid the price because a lot of the drywall got wet. The other thing they did wrong here from a sequential standpoint is they poured concrete on the different floors while the drywall was in place as well. So what happened there was, as the concrete was curing, there was a lot of moisture in the air, and that moisture in the air increased the relative humidity in the space, and that condensated on the drywall walls, and that turned itself into mold. So at the end of the day, almost every piece of drywall in this building had to be removed, and the building tightened up, the rest of the concrete poured, and then the drywall put back in. Lots of delays, and it wasn't a fun project to be on at all. We talk about poor construction practices as well. There's another example of recently on the west coast of Canada, a small apartment building, 3 or 4, maybe 5 stories, and their construction materials weren't stored properly. They were exposed to the weather, and the contractor, in their wisdom, if they weren't smart enough to store them properly, they weren't smart enough to inspect them before they put them in, because all the floor joists and when we were called in, what we were seeing was floor joists and floorboards. If they weren't wet, or if they weren't moldy, they were at least wet. So a lot of wet material and a lot of moldy material went into the building process. So poor construction practices are definitely a cause of mold growth. Building envelope failures. Gord will talk more about building envelope failures when we get there. However, just a quick story of a hotel that I had the pleasure of doing an assessment in a number of years ago. I was asked to come in just to do they were asked me to test for mildew in a half dozen hotel rooms. And I went in, there was no odor. I couldn't see any mold. There was a little bit of black mildew-ish type material around the windows, but can be fairly typical. So I knew there's a bit of condensation there. Inadvertently, when I was looking at one of the windows, my knee touched the wall underneath the window, and it felt hollow. So I peeled back a piece of the vinyl wallpaper, and vinyl wallpaper is it's not the best thing at all to put on your walls when it comes to mold. But anyway, I pulled a piece back, and there was no drywall in the wall cavity at all. It was empty. There was so much water that had come through the building envelope from the outside that every floor on one particular side of the building was full of mold and had to be remediated. Interior and exterior floods. Exterior floods are, that could be anything from torrential rains to some kind of sewer backup outside that came inside. Interiors, we deal with interior flooding an awful lot, from a pipe that's burst, or a sprinkler line that's burst, or a radiator that's burst, or something like that. We had a sewer backup in a hospital it was in Newfoundland, and it was a sanitary sewer that backed up into a basement, and the basement had all kinds of patient areas and stuff. Unsanitary sewer went up about between 2 and 3 feet on every wall in the basement. So they figured it was about 1.7 miles of linear drywall plus 2 feet or 3 feet that had to come out. It was pretty messy. But so interior floods are a problem. Condensation. I mentioned condensation in the poor construction practices, but condensation will form if you get a warm air that turns to cold air, and you get a dew point. My sister had a closet where she told me, once a month she was cleaning mold off a wall in a closet. All that was going on there, it was in a basement. The closet was on an exterior wall. That wall was cold. When she closed the door of the closet, the air inside the closet would cool down, and you'd get condensation on the wall, and that happens enough times, she was getting mold. The fix was just to keep the door open so there was lots of air changes going on inside the closet. And then the other one that we got listed here is wet sections of an air handling unit or ductwork. I don't normally see an awful lot of this, but it's certainly a place that we should be inspecting for sure. Now, normally the mold is not going to grow directly on the units or ductwork. It'll grow on the debris or the dust particles or organic matter that's inside the ductwork is where it grows. So let's talk briefly about regulatory responses to mold in buildings. Again, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, this whole mold field is fairly, it's getting fairly old now. And a lot of the references, like the one I just brought up here from Health Canada, is from 2004. But really, there's not a lot that has changed since 2004. It's not like how rapid we saw COVID changing in the past 12 months, and it seemed like every day or every week there was new science coming out, and we were changing how we thought about it. Mold in the beginning was like that in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and it it got to a place where the science was strong and complete, and not that people aren't still researching, but it's in a spot now where it's pretty stable. So back in 2004, Health Canada said this, and they're still saying it now, that living or working in a building with material mold damage, it's harmful to your health. So they advise us to prevent mold growth by controlling of moisture sources. Quickly dry out water damaged materials. We talked about the 24 to 48 hours. And remove any mold growth found using careful remediation protocols. So that's what they were saying in 2004. In 2007, they came out with another guideline, but this one was for residential, for homes. So the further advice regarding homes and residential settings, so they're saying now control humidity, diligently repair any water damage, and clean any visible or concealed mold growth. So they mentioned concealed mold growth this time because as we started to learn more, it was very obvious that and we see it in our work too, that we're probably only seeing between 70 and 80% of the mold in a moldy building. I'm sorry, we're only seeing 20 to 30% of mold in a moldy building. There's 70 to 80% of that mold is hidden somewhere. So that's part of the challenge, is knowing where to look for that concealed mold. Now, the other thing that was important in this Health Canada document that came out was the recommendations applied to they talked about regardless of mold species. Prior to this, there was specific mold species that these agencies talked about. One in particular was Stachybotrys chartarum. I'm sure that most of you people have heard that before, that species of mold. Aspergillus was another one, Chaetomium. And some of these guidelines in the beginning were built around the health effects of those types of molds. This document now, this Health Canada document, was coming out saying it doesn't matter what the species of mold is, it's all bad for you. So it all has to be treated the same way. Provincially, it's different across the board provincially. You can go to all the different provinces and territories in Canada, and you're going to find that the governments are dealing with mold a little bit different. This is an alert from Ontario. There's alerts in all the Atlantic provinces. Some of the provinces, Manitoba is one, and Alberta is another one, that they have huge documents to talk about how to deal with mold in their provinces. So and then everything in between. So the whole gamut is there. It's what's important about that is regardless of where you are living, if you're dealing with mold, it's not a bad idea to jump on the government website and see what they're saying about it, to make sure that you're doing it right. There's other agencies too that sort of can dictate to us about ways or reasons to deal with mold. So the public health, now I'm from Nova Scotia, and the public health in Nova Scotia, we never ever heard of public health until COVID. Now all we hear is public health. And I know in Ontario, public health had a lot to say in about mold, and they have put out lots of different orders. But you know, that said, public health units do have the authority to do that. Municipal property standards, property standard bylaws, residential tenancy acts can deal with mold. And sometimes landlord and tenant boards, they can issue orders for repairs or assign costs for moldy housing and that sort of stuff. So it's being recognized by agencies all the way up from the federal government down to a landlord tenant board. Now, again, I remind you, if there's any questions that you have, put them in the chat. Gordon and I will be in the chat while you're watching this, so we'll be able to answer you as the presentation continues. But let's talk about water damage restoration. We talked earlier about making sure that we have making sure that we get to a water infiltration quickly so the mold won't start to form. So this is where the restoration companies come in, and the drying piece. So the professional response from the IICRC in this standard here, S500, this is the Bible for restoration companies that talks about building restoration and drying after a water event. You can see here in this photo, those are fans after a water event that are blowing air at floor level. You can see the baseboards have been removed, and these fans are drying, are pushing air and drying. And this, you can see the blue taller unit in the back. That's a dehumidifier that's taking moisture out of the air. So they would have got to this very rapidly, and they're drying it out. And we would probably take a look at the boxes that are on the left there. They were sitting on the floor, and there was a water event there. There's probably some issues that are associated with the under part of that box for sure. Here's another way, couple of ways we can evaluate for trapped or hidden moisture. On the right is a moisture meter. We just stick the two prongs into the wall or whatever building whatever we're trying to determine whether there's moisture, whether it's carpet or whether it's wood or whatever the case may be, whatever building material. And then we're going to get a reading on how high the moisture is. On the left, we got an infrared camera that's taken a picture of the same wall that we saw in the previous slide. And you can see, and Gord will talk to you a lot more about this in his presentation. But that's telling us where the difference in color is there. It means that section of the wall is a little bit colder. We're getting that color, and that's indication of moisture behind there, even if we don't see anything on the front side. We want to check for hidden moisture. Does the place that you're in have a subfloor? You have to ask the question. If it has a subfloor, there's a very good chance that underneath that subfloor there could be water. So we want to take a look and make sure that that is being looked at. Trap moisture. In this situation here, we had a nice set of cabinets here. The remediation was complete. The moisture remediation was complete. And everybody went away, thought everything was fine. Nobody thought to remove the cabinets and look behind them to see if there was moisture back there. Eventually, for some reason, the cabinets were pulled away, and this was the result behind the cabinets. So we could have saved a lot of heartache with the removal of actual mold if we had to remove this cabinet prior and dried the wall. instead of waiting till it turned moldy. Standard of care for mold in buildings. We'll talk a bit about that. So some places, this is the Environmental Abatement Council of Ontario. They have their own set of guidelines that is pretty much the Bible in Ontario to work with mold. So they talk about small, medium, and large scale mold remediation. They talk about the protection of workers and occupants. And this was developed in consultation with not just the Ontario Ministry of Labour, but all kinds of other stakeholders as well. There was contractors that helped put these guidelines together. There was consultants. I believe we were on the board that helped put them together, and so they got opinion from all the different sectors before they put it together. This is the Bible, the Canadian Construction Association Mold Guidelines. Again, it was out in 2004, and it was written to assist contractors in reducing risk of mold. So it talks about design, construction practices to prevent mold growth. It gives really good advice on background and legal insurance matters as it pertains to mold, health concerns, how to do an assessment. It has all the mold remediation guidelines there, how to communicate hazards, demolition considerations, and how to choose a contractor. So this is a very important document in the evolution of mold work in Canada. And prior to this, there were other standards out there, but they were all U.S. standards. So the Canadian Construction Association put this document together, and it's held the test of time. So if you don't have this and you deal with mold at all, you need to have this, and it's free of charge. You just got to download it. In all the guidelines that you see down below here, and I won't go through them all, but there's a number of them that we use. Some of them for certain things, like the one on your far right there, mold remediation. It's this one here. They talk about stuff in buildings that you can reclaim. Like if you have a hard desk, what do you have to do to reclaim that? If you have a stuffed animal, how do you clean and reclaim that? So it talks an awful lot about building content and gives some good advice on that. So all these different guidelines we can use for different things. But they all, every one of them talk about the next few slides I'm going to show you. They all talk about risk assessment. So when they talk about risk assessment, they're saying all species of mold growth require remediation. Hidden mold growth impacts air and requires investigation. Risks must be communicated to occupants. They all talk about, in workplaces, using the JOSH committees, invite the JOSH committees to see the testing. The standards are recommended. They recommend disclosure to all occupants and consider need for evacuation. So every one of these guidelines talks about and considers occupants in buildings. They all talk about sensitive occupants. So there's susceptible occupants or settings, and these require additional care. If you have infants or elderly, immune compromised, people with strong allergies, residents in healthcare facilities, immediate relocation may be required. And then anytime you're cleaning up mold, anybody who's susceptible should be moved during that type of remediation. Identify underlying causes of mold growth. I think I'm going to make this my last slide, because I think I want to make a strong point here. I think we have to remediate mold as soon as we possibly can. And people have asked me many times, should you fix the mold, or should you clean up the mold, or should you fix the water leak first? Well, that's the million-dollar question. And I think it depends. If you got a sense, if the mold is in an area where there's sensitive receptors, then I think you have to clean the mold first, and then worry about getting rid of or fixing the water problem. But when we can, we should do it simultaneously. Anyway, and then the last point, clean it as soon as possible. Right. So I'm going to turn this over to Gord. I'm going to flip through the next few slides because I didn't get to all my slides. So I'll give you Gord Rdzowski.
All right, so now we're going to flip it over to building science and moisture control. So thank you, David. We're going to first of all talk about the building and enclosure control layers. In building science, we treat the building enclosure as having various control layers. What we're trying to control essentially is water, air, heat, vapor, sound, and fire. And in those control layers, the water, air, heat, and vapor are the most important of these aspects. So this presentation is going to deal primarily with water, air, heat, and vapor issues. We've already talked a little bit about what vapor condensation is. And essentially, condensation is there's moisture in warm air. And when warm, humidified air reaches a cold surface, oftentimes the moisture particles, the moisture in the warm, humidified air will condense out onto that surface. So we use the example of the beer, can of beer or the soft drink in the insulated enclosure. So balance of wetting and drying. Let's go into the 4Ds. First one is called deflection. So on a building enclosure, in the design, it's desirable to try to deflect as much water off the surface as possible to prevent it from trying to travel back inwards or through a path of least resistance. So one of the 4 principles is called deflection. Second one is drainage. Here's an example on a roof where obviously water is collecting following rain and it's not being effectively drained. So if we've got any flaws or deficiencies in the roof, that moisture may percolate into the underlying layers and cause concerns. The next one is durability, is choosing components that are durable and can resist the presence of unwanted moisture. And then drying is the 4th of the 4Ds. So understanding how things dry. There's 3 different principles that typically are involved. One is called diffusion, which is the movement through materials on a molecular level, as we see here. The second one is evaporation. It's converting liquid to a gas at a surface. And the third one is convection, which is air movement being transported. So basically the way convection works is it's a circular motion. Warmer air has faster moving molecules, making it less dense, and it rises while cooler air drops down. So that gives you a little bit of background on sort of some of the things that we consider in building science related to the building enclosure. Now we're going to move quickly into what happens in a building envelope review. and how we get to the remediation or mitigation of problems that are identified. So the next couple of slides deal with the project process, which is phase one is doing a condition assessment and an evaluation and a system selection. So that's the first phase, is we have to understand what the problem is. We do various means of evaluation. In the second phase, we move into designing an appropriate solution and then tendering it out to contractors. In the third phase, we're basically undertaking the work that needs to be done. So in a condition assessment, we're using various means to inform and educate ourselves on what is happening. This could be in the form of a visual review, using air leakage testing, thermography. Dave showed you an image earlier in his presentation with an infrared picture. We can use water testing, vapor transmission, monitoring, and destructive testing. We've basically got a lot of tricks at our disposal to help us understand what's going on so we can get to the bottom of what the issues are. Here's an example on the condition assessment where vapor diffusion has resulted in condensation and has caused damage to the wall cavity components that you see here. Sometimes the problem is associated with a condition called thermal bridging, where the manner in which the building is constructed and detailed and with the different components provides different transference of heat energy. So in some places, the surfaces may be too cold or more cold than other surfaces because they are either inboard, outboard of the insulation, or the heat, the building energy heat is collecting. Sometimes the problem is associated with air leakage that causes condensation. So we talked about transport of moisture in air. So warm air is trying to get outside the enclosure and on its path to the path of least resistance to the exterior. It's causing condensation in places where that warm air comes into contact with cold surface. One of the methods that we use to identify where air leakage occurs is smoke testing, where we set up and try to simulate how air moves through things in the building enclosure. So this is a in situ test that is done. We create pressure and we inject theatrical smoke, and we follow and trace the path that smoke takes through the enclosure to help us identify what needs to be sealed and where the openings are. This is a process that we talked about, which is called infrared thermography, where we use a heat-sensitive thermal imaging system that allows us to see where heat loss occurs in the building envelope. In this particular image, we see air leakage patterns that are exhibited at the top of the roof parapet. So this is an elevation from the Red Deer City Hall in central Alberta. We see patterns indicative of air leakage at the roof parapet. We have patterns that show us both air leakage and thermal bridging at the precast concrete panel connections, air leakage around the strip windows. So these are the kinds of anomalies that can be identified qualitatively and quickly using infrared thermography. Basically, it helps inform our assessors as to where we should focus our further investigations. We often try to simulate water penetration or how water is able to enter into building enclosures using in situ water penetration testing. So now that we've completed the assessment, now we're moving right into the evaluation. And the evaluation often employs using various models, software models such as WUFI, Therm, Window, Energy Star, etc. We basically take a look at what we've learned and we test it on a computer to determine why things like this are occurring. So here's the next few slides deal with what the output of some of this modeling is using WUFI. WUFI is energy software program that looks at both drying potential and wetting risk by predicting dynamic heat and moisture flows. So we basically model a wall assembly, and then we subject it to design temperatures and design humidities, and we see by simulation where problems might occur in the modeling. So in this example, we're using exterior insulation finish system, a stucco wall cladding with EPS insulation and BAT insulation. So this is an assembly that we're looking at for a hotel and swimming pool enclosure. So this is the existing wall that was having issues, and the WFI base case tells us that in that model of what they had, the OSB plywood in the assembly becomes saturated from vapor diffusion as relative humidity increases. So we use a threshold of about 16% moisture content. So anything above 16% is considered problematic. So the wall assembly needs to be able to tolerate a minimum of 16% moisture content. So that previous example shown, the WFI model suggests that at 16% relative humidity or higher, the plywood in the wall assembly becomes saturated with moisture. So we need to move on and test something else. So in this particular example, we came up with another option where we used the stucco and basically avoided adding additional insulation inboard of the EFIS. So all of the insulation is on the outside of the stud cavity. And then we remodeled it, and we find out that in this option, that the plywood will remain intact at 16% moisture content. So this is a good example of what we can be building for that swimming pool enclosure. We modeled a second scenario here where we're using lime stucco, so not EFIS, left in a half-inch air gap, put a weather resistive barrier, half-inch plywood, and then had a traditional stud wall that was filled with 4 inches of spray foam and a half-inch interior gypsum board. So under the same conditions, in this option, we find out that also the plywood will remain intact at 16%. So what we're doing here is we're showing an owner what the potential options are for reconstructing the swimming pool enclosure at the hotel that is the subject. And the third one is using, again, cement stucco on the outside, 2x6 wood studs with fiberglass bat, poly interior gypsum board. And again, we find out that in this case, this assembly, if built correctly, can actually withstand up to 55% interior relative humidity. So we remember that this is a swimming pool enclosure, so it's imperative that whatever we build as the building enclosure can withstand this level of humidification on the interior of the building. And then this is at 70%, and it seems to work again. So we've provided the owner with various options. So now that we've provided these options, the client can select from those options which option they would like us to pursue further, and then get pricing for that. So in the system selection, we always want to know that what the cost differences are. So if you want the best time to influence lower cost is right at the beginning of the job. So making sure that you've got a solid plan going in and that you can clearly communicate to the contractor what you want, that's the best time to influence price. If you make adjustments during the course of the work, the price will obviously climb. That's the purpose of that slide. Once we've selected our system, we prepare drawings and specifications. We provide that design, finished product back to the client for final review, and then we go to the tendering part. We can provide contractor vetting if required. we typically invite the contractor to the sites, and then we gather the bids back and compare them, hopefully apples to apples, and provide a recommendation for the client as to how they should proceed. In pre-construction, what we often do is, now that we've created a contract, we've hired a contractor, we've set the schedule, one of the first things that's done is we do what's called a project startup meeting, where we bring everyone together and try to get everybody back on the same page in terms of what the objectives are, what the schedule is, answer any questions that they may have. Part of the pre-con work is we also will do what's called mock-up and testing. To further gather the understanding of the project team, we will often take a part of that project and build what we call a mock-up, where we bring all the various trades together and say, this is our standard for construction on the project. We go through questions that they may have. We'll answer their questions, and we modify as required any details to gain further acceptance and understanding. And then we say, that's the standard for the job that we want repeated through the entire job. And then we will monitor it going forward. So here's an example of what we do is value add to the client in the project is called project management and oversight, where we're basically taking a look at the drawing details and making sure that things that we require are in place, and that the construction is faithful to the design. So we come out to site and we periodically review the progress of the work to make sure that the work is done in accordance with the design. Making sure all of the treatments that are required to provide waterproofing and a proper enclosure. We've got proper laying, proper overlapping, proper adhesion of the various component layers. Finally, the project is closed out, deficiencies are corrected, and a final report is provided. The process, the main takeaway from this process that we just outlined for you is it's designed to protect the client. You can have cost, low cost, you can have speed, you can have quality. Typically, you can only get two of the three. So that's the presentation that we have for you this morning. David and I are available to answer any questions that you have from the chat. And we thank you for your time this morning, and we will be pleased to follow up with you for any further information that you require. So, Dave, any final thoughts?
Well, Gord, I think we still got a few minutes here, so it might not. I wouldn't mind circling back to, because I had mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about. I was going to talk a bit about COVID and how that may have affected any of what we've spoke about today, and I think when we talk about COVID and mold, it's the preventative maintenance piece that we're talking about, because if we got our buildings that have been vacant for, underoccupied or unoccupied for a long period of time, and I think in the beginning of COVID, a lot of our buildings were unoccupied for a period of time, and now that people are starting to slowly come back. Like, I know that our offices at Pinchin, we're still only at 20% capacity in our offices, and we'll probably stay there for a bit yet. But what happens when you got this low capacity in your buildings is I don't think the buildings are getting the same level of inspection. If you have say a plumbing leak in a kitchen, if nobody's going to the kitchen, or they're going once a day or something like that, you may not notice that there's a problem there. Or if there's a roof leak, or a flood in the basement area or something like that, if you're not around inspecting that, you're not going to come across it. So what would be extremely important in that circumstance is prior to coming back into a building is giving it an inspection and making sure that some of these conditions aren't occurring, because one of the things we're going to want to do as we bring people back into a building is make sure that they feel comfortable and confident in the space itself. So if we come back and we start bringing our people back and immediately they're getting sick or they're smelling mold or it's musty, then we're losing that that confidence that they have, I guess. Another issue, and it goes towards a bit of what Gord was talking about condensation. If we got sections of buildings that are, whether it's an entire building or a section of a building that is closed down, because it's closed down, we may have done something to the conditioning in that building. We may have turned the heat down. We may have put less air in it. Regardless of what we were doing in the building, there is potential that if we're messing around with the conditioning in the building, there's potential for there to be a buildup of condensation and potential mold on the surfaces, like I talked about in my sister's closet earlier. So again, I think it's important that we understand some of these things and not only understand them, but I think we have to action them. Now, I don't think from a preventive maintenance standpoint, I think we don't have to be as robust with our inspection process as we would if we had 100% occupancy. But I think some of the systems that are in our building need to be on some kind of regular preventive maintenance program, like ventilation systems, for example. You know, we should be making sure that they're working properly. We should be making sure that the filtration is appropriate in them. One of the things we can use, one of the systems that is important to check out before we come back is our potable water systems. If we want to talk about potential for there to be mold growth, the Legionella piece aside, you know, if we're not using a water system for a long period of time, then what's going to happen is we're going to get stagnant water in pipes. We're going to have dead legs, and we're going to have the potential for there to be Legionella. But the other thing that there's the potential to happen is if we get any kind of sediment inside these copper pipes, and because of their inactivity, there could be leaching out of the water of copper and other hard metals. So you get leaching of copper, you get some potential pitting and corrosion on the copper pipe. So you got a thin piece of pipe, maybe in a few locations throughout your system. You got sediment in the pipe. You come in, you turn on your taps, and all of a sudden there's a piece of something sitting in one of these pits, and the pressure from turning on the tap drives this, and now you got a small pinhole, and the small pinhole will go undetected because the water will just keep slowly coming out, and the mold will grow, and then eventually at some point it'll show itself, and by that time it'll be too late. So there's ways to mitigate that kind of stuff prior to coming back, and what we recommend is ensuring that you're flushing your water systems on a regular basis when there's nobody there, and that's not a big deal. That's maybe once a week, turning taps on for 5 minutes or something like that, just making sure that the water is moving through the pipes, and you're not allowing it to sit there and corrode and start to pit and potentially causing some problems. You know, the old adage, prevention and cure. You know, prevention really is the way to go here. And if you're going to be in, and everything is connected. So if you're going to be in the building and you're going to be having some kind of maintenance program and you're going to be flushing, then people are going to be walking around the building too. And there should be some sort of a checklist or some way that people are looking above ceilings and they're looking around windows, and they're seeing if there has been any failure in the structure that is causing water to come in, because to catch it right away is going to save an awful lot of money down the road.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in here and just say, from a building envelope perspective, David had suggested that it's important to, once mold is discovered inside the building, to get rid of the mold as quickly as possible. And I want to emphasize that in my world, mold is a symptom of a larger problem. And typically in Canada, that problem is often a failure of the building fabric in some perspective. So if you've got mold and your only response is to remediate the mold that you've become aware of, you could be destined to have a problem again if you don't address why the mold was able to propagate. So I think that's the message that I want to leave everyone with today, is that you need to really understand the condition of your building fabric and how that is contributing to some of the issues you may be experiencing on the interior, as Dave has shared with you this morning.
I think just before we leave, I want to leave you with this. Gordon and I had a chat. Last week about an interesting project where a client was getting rodents into a building, and I thought, well, I wonder if building science could help us there. And Gord was able to give us lots of insight. If we know how water gets into a building, then rodents are probably getting in the same way. So the same type of an assessment on a building was as helpful for keeping mice out as it was for keeping water out. So building science is a fun science.
We want to thank everyone for participating today, and we hope you've enjoyed our presentation.
Thank you very much, guys.